All right, welcome back. We are starting our discussion here of another part of the brain. This is the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is going to be formed of three main parts. First part on here is this oval-shaped structure. This is the thalamus, and this is representing almost 80% of the size of the diencephalon. Another part of the diencephalon is going to be the part below the thalamus, which is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. And the third part of the diencephalon is going to be located above the thalamus, so we call this as the epithalamus. And the epithalamus has two main compartments. We've got the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus. This is the part I'm pointing to on here. Choroid plexus. And the pineal gland. Pineal gland is the other major compartment of the epithalamus. So again, looking now at the diencephalon. Diencephalon is going to be formed by thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. Epithalamus is going to be formed by the choroid plexus, pineal gland. We can first add the thalamus that represents 80% of the diencephalon. It acts as a gateway to the cerebral cortex. Its function is to sort, edit, and relay the information, mediating sensations, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. So all the different functions or the different functions of the cerebral cortex are going to be mediated and regulated by the thalamus. So I like to give it a nickname here as the vice president. This is a part of the brain that will be sorting, editing, relaying the information to the president, which is the cerebral cortex. So think of it this way. Can you feel the shirt that you're wearing? If you're wearing a t-shirt, a shirt, can you hear the sound of the AC? Yes. Were you paying attention to those sensations before I tell you? You were not paying attention to them. They will go to your subconscious. They will end here at the level of the thalamus. So the thalamus will decide, all right, so you want to focus in the lecture. So your cerebral cortex needs to pay attention towards what you're hearing more than what you feel, more than other things that you can hear in the background. So you are detecting a huge number of sensations all in the same time, but you only pay attention to very few of them. That's why you can't text and drive. Why? Because if you are texting while you're driving, what's going to happen? You're not paying enough attention to the road. Because rather than paying attention to the road, you are paying attention now to what you are writing down in the text message. All right. So I'm not sure if you did watch a movie called Lucy. It was a few years ago. Did you watch a movie called Lucy? No. All right. So whenever you get a chance, just watch. It's a good movie. So what they are saying in this movie is that there is a drug that enables the brain to detect better sensations, to fully, for you to be able to fully use your brain cells, and that you are using just a small number of brain cells, and this drug opens the ability of the other brain cells to function. This is not scientific, this is not accurate, and if you are paying attention to every single sensations that you are detecting, try to imagine that you are paying attention to everything. So you can feel the shirt, you can feel the pressure on your buttocks when you are while you are sitting. You can you are paying attention to the sound of the AC, for example, in the background. You're paying attention to all those sensations at the same time. Actually, a person will get crazy. You can't pay attention to all those sensations all in the same time. And the function here of the thalamus is to sort edit what should be presented to the president, which is the cerebral cortex, and what should be kept and remain in your subconscious. You don't need it now. You don't need to pay attention now to this issue. All right, so this is a decision that will be taken by your subconscious, by your thalamus. If we moved down from the thalamus, we've got the hypothalamus, and I like to give it a nickname. This is the secretary of the office here. The hypothalamus is going to be mainly focusing on the very basic tasks that you need to take care of, but you don't need to get your conscious brain to worry about, like a regulation of your respiratory rate. You don't need to keep paying attention to how fast should I be breathing now. So if I'm running, I will be breathing faster because I need more oxygen. This is not something that you think of. Your emotional response, the regulation of your blood pressure, respiratory rate, force of contraction, gastrointestinal tract motility, all those autonomic activities are going to be taken care of by the hypothalamus. Think of it like the secretary of the office is going to be responsible to respond to mails, to respond to the media, for example, if this is the president of a big company, let's say. So response to the media concerning basic issues, respond to complaints from customers, and so on. Those are very basic tasks, but they need to be taken care of for normal function of this institute. All right. And this is why your mother, for example, will tell you, don't make any decisions if you're angry, or if you are so happy, or if you are angry. Why? Because at this point you're gonna be mainly here using the secretary of the office. You didn't think of the details. You didn't use your president, your cerebral cortex to make the decision. All right. Emotional responses like the perception of pleasure, fear, rage, biological rhythms, and drives. So I usually mention here as an example, if you know this person for the last month and you are so happy of being with him or her, all right, so don't make this live decision just because you are happy at this point, or you're angry with this person at this point. So if you're angry with a person at one point, all right, so don't make the decision to break up. So just calm down, take your time, rethink, reprocess all the details before making a decision. Also, if you're so happy, all right, so don't just propose. Would you marry me? All right, you need to use your cerebral cortex. You need to process the information. Again, in the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is where we're going to be solving complicated tasks. Is where we're going to be recalling the memories, solving problems, multitasking. All right. So again, who is the president here? Who is the president? Your conscious brain. Who is the president here? Cerebrum, cerebral cortex. Who's gonna be the vice president that will be sorting, editing the information that gets exposed to the president? Thalamus. And who is taking care of your emotional responses, your basic needs, regulation of the blood pressure, regulation of the body temperature, respiratory rate, and so on? Secretary of the office. Who is the secretary of the office? Who's taking care of the autonomic activities, emotional responses? It's your hypothalamus. So think of it: cerebrum president, thalamus is the vice president, secretary of the office for the basic tasks. This is going to be the hypothalamus, below the thalamus, hypothalamus. All right, easy. Questions? All right, so looking at the third part of the diencephalon, it's the epithalamus, located above the thalamus. And the different parts of the epithalamus do not play a major role here in decision makings or regulation of different body functions. They play a very limited role in this aspect. The epithalamus is formed by the choroid plexus, which is going to be producing the cerebrospinal fluid that circulates within the ventricles of the brain, around the brain and the spinal cord. And the pineal gland is going to be releasing a hormone called the melatonin that regulates the sleep-wake cycles. And if you go to the pharmacy at the sleep aid section, you will find melatonin here is to regulate the biological rhythms of sleep and wake cycle. Moving on to our third part of the brain, it's going to be the brainstem. The brainstem is going to be formed of three regions: midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. Midbrain, this bulging part on here is the pons, and straight part on here, it's the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is going to be, or the brainstem here first, it's going to be formed by embedded nuclei. It controls the automatic behaviors necessary for survival, regulation of blood pressure, respiratory rate. It's also going to be the pathway for the fibers that are traveling up and down, carrying signals towards and from the brain. Important terminology on here. Please write this down. Please write this down in your notes. If we are looking at clusters of cell bodies of the neurons in the CNS, we call those are nuclei. It's a nucleus. Cell bodies of the neurons located outside of the CNS in the peripheral nervous system, we call this is a ganglion. So again, if you remember how a nerve cell looks like, nerve cell has a cell body like what you see on here, and a long process like this. This is what we call the nerve fiber or the axon. So the cell bodies inside the CNS, we call them nuclei. Clusters of cell bodies inside the CNS, it's a nucleus. Located outside of the CNS in the peripheral nervous system, it's called the ganglion or ganglia, the plural now. If we're looking at the axons or the nerve fibers, clusters of axons or nerve fibers that are traveling inside the CNS are called tracts. A bundle of axons or nerve fibers traveling outside of the CNS in the peripheral nervous system, it's what we call a nerve. So again, when we mention nuclei, means a cluster of cell bodies in the CNS. When we mention ganglion, it's a cluster of cell bodies located outside in the peripheral nervous system. Axons, nerve fibers, those are either tracts, if we're looking at bundles of nerve fibers, of axons, traveling in the CNS, those are called tracts. nerve fibers traveling outside of the CNS, those are going to be forming a nerve. So the brainstem consists of nuclei, which are clusters of cell bodies of the neurons, and also tracts that will be carrying those signals up towards my cerebrum, or down from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. The brainstem is associated with 10 of 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So we've got 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are getting their origin from the brain. 10 of those 12 pairs are coming from the brain stem. And we're looking here at the midbrain first. Then I have this bulging part. This is my pons. And I've got this straight part traveling down to connect the brain to the spinal cord. This is my medulla oblongata. So again, 3 parts, brainstem of the brainstem. First part is the midbrain. Next is going to be the pons. And the third part on here, it's my medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. The midbrain is located between the diencephalon and the pons. It's going to have the reflex centers for the eye and head movements. It's also going to be containing a duct that allows the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, to travel down from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. If you remember, what are the ventricles that we've seen, that we have mentioned a little about last session? Ventricles, those are the brain cavities that contain the cerebrospinal fluid. So if we're looking on here, this is my midbrain, located posterior to the pons and the medulla oblongata, like this. It's my cerebellum. We've got a cavity filled with fluid between the cerebellum on one side, pons and medulla oblongata on the other. This is called the fourth ventricle. Up above my midbrain here, this is going to be my hypothalamus. This is going to be my thalamus. And this is my choroid plexus and the pineal gland. So those are the 3 different parts of my diencephalon. Embedded in the diencephalon, I've got another ventricle. It's what we call the third ventricle. This is my third ventricle. The CSF is going to be circulating between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, passing through a duct And this duct, as you see on here, it's passing through what part of the brain? Through my midbrain. We call this duct that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, it's my cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. Next part is going to be this bulging part of the brain stem. It's my pons. And the pons, as you see on here, it's forming the anterior wall of the fourth ventricle. Pons is mainly acting as a conducting area. So its main function is to carry the signals up and down from the brain to the spinal cord and from the spinal cord to the brain. It contains important nuclei that will act as respiratory centers. Also, it carries the nuclei for 3 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Those are cranial nerves number 5, 6, and 7, trigeminal, abducens nerve, and facial nerve. So those 3 cranial nerves are getting their origin from the pons. A third part of the brain stem, it's the medulla oblongata that is acting as a gateway between the pons and the spinal cord below it. It is a part that will be passing to connect with the spinal cord through the foramen magnum. And that's why if a person got an intracranial hemorrhage causing a compression of the brain down, this can squeeze the medulla oblongata against the foramen magnum. And this compression can be lethal. Why? Because we've got very important centers in the medulla oblongata, and this includes the centers regulating the respiratory rhythm, the heart rate, and blood pressure. Also, the medulla oblongata are gonna have reflex centers responsible for coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting. All those centers are gonna be present also in the medulla oblongata. And as you see on here, the medulla oblongata also gonna be sharing in the formation of the anterior wall of the fourth ventricle. Moving on to our last part of the brain, this is going to be the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is going to be representing 11% of the brain mass. It's going to be located, as you see, posterior to both the pons and the medulla oblongata. The main function of the cerebellum is to subconsciously provide precise timing and appropriate patterns of skeletal muscle contraction. In other words, coordinate your skeletal muscle movements. So when you are walking, for example, do you decide how strong should you be contracting your quadriceps on the right side? How strong you should be contracting the gluteus maximus? What should be your arm movement when you are walking? Do you decide to do all those movements and the accurate timing of each of them? No, you don't decide to do all this. Your cerebellum is going to be responsible to take care of all those muscle contraction timing and patterns of contraction of your skeletal muscles. That's why if a person got a stroke affecting his cerebellum, he will have an uncoordinated muscle movement. In some cases, he needs to look at the position of his joints. He needs to look at uh, the force of contraction of his muscles when he is walking, because the part of the brain that is responsible for regulating the timing and the force of contraction to allow coordinated muscle movement, it's the cerebellum. The cerebellum, it's going to be formed by two cerebellar hemispheres. The right cerebellar hemisphere and the left cerebellar hemisphere. I believe I did have let me show you here an anterior view of the cerebellum. Looking on here, I have two cerebellar hemispheres, and you see there is a connection on here between the two cerebellar hemispheres. This connection on here is what we call the vermis. Vermis is going to be the connection between the two cerebellar hemispheres, as you see. In this diagram, right and left cerebellar hemispheres, and the connection in between, it's the vermis. Vermis. Each hemisphere is going to be formed of three different lobes. We're looking on here. The anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and we've got a third one on here. This is my flocculonodular lobe. So again, the cerebellum is formed of two cerebellar hemispheres. Don't get confused between cerebral hemispheres and cerebellar hemispheres. Cerebral hemispheres, those are the hemispheres, the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. Cerebellar hemispheres, those are the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. Again, we've got three lobes: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and flocculonodular lobe. You'll see the outer part of the cerebellum, it's formed by the gray matter. The inner part of the cerebellum, it's going to be the white matter. And if you notice, the white matter looks like what? What does the white matter of the cerebellum looks like? Anybody? What does this looks like? The white matter. Tree. It looks like a tree. So they call it the tree of life. Arbor means tree, vitae life, or vita life. All right, so again, see on here, arbor, vita, or vitae is going to be the white matter of the cerebellum. White matter of the cerebellum. Arbor vitae. Again, the main function of the cerebellum is the coordination of skeletal muscle movements, and this is needed to maintain the posture and the balance of the body. Moving on to the ventricles of the brain. We've got 4 ventricles that contain cerebrospinal fluid, and they are connected to one another and connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. The 4 ventricles on here, as you see, we've got 2 C-shaped ventricles. Those are my lateral ventricles. The 2 lateral ventricles are going to be connected to a ventricle located embedded in the diencephalon on here. This is going to be my 3rd ventricle. And the 3rd ventricle is going to be connected by the cerebral aqueduct, if you remember, passing through the midbrain, to the 4th ventricle, which is located between the pons medulla on one side and the cerebellum on the other. So again, what are the 4 ventricles that we've got in the brain? We've got 2 C-shaped ventricles. Those are the embedded in the cerebral hemisphere. Those are my lateral ventricles. We've got the 3rd ventricle in the diencephalon and the 4th ventricle between the midbrain pons, between the pons medulla on one side and the cerebellum on the other side. If we look in here closely at the structure of the lateral ventricles, we can see lateral ventricles will have 3 horns: anterior horn, posterior horn, and the inferior horn. Can you remind me what is the type of neuroglial cells that will be lining those ventricles that we've discussed in the last session? Do you remember what neuroglial cell did have those long cilia to allow the propulsion of the CSF inside the ventricles of the brain? Do you remember? Ependymal cells. Ependymal cells, exactly. Ependymal cells. Looking at 2 functional brain systems, we've got the first is the limbic system. Limbic system is going to be the brain system formed by multiple brain areas located mainly in the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere and the diencephalon. This includes part of the diencephalon and some cerebral structures that are encircling the brainstem. We don't need to memorize exactly what are the different parts here of the limbic system. But what we need to remember is that the limbic system is a part of the brain that is going to be responsible for the production of emotions like anger, fear, conflict. And it's going to be those different parts of the brain will work together for the modification of the behavior. So again, limbic system is going to be producing the emotions and it's going to be responsible for the modification of the behavior. Reticular formation is going to be formed of three broad columns of nuclei located along the length of the midbrain. They are connected to the hypothalamus, thalamus, cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and spinal cord. And the main function of the reticular formation is to maintain the alert state of the cerebral cortex. And if a person has a disturbance in the RAS or the reticular activation system, an injury to the reticular formation, he will have a permanent unconsciousness, or a person will be in a coma. So you see on here, this is the reticular formations. They are nuclei, clusters of nerve cells located in the brainstem. And those nuclei are going to be sending out signals to the cerebral cortex for it to maintain its alert state, for you to be conscious. So what kind of signals am I receiving as reticular formation? Think of what sensations will make you wake up when you are sleeping. So light. So if somebody enters your room while you're sleeping and it turns on the light, you're going to be activating the reticular formation. You're going to gain consciousness. If you hear sounds, auditory impulses also going to be activating here the reticular formation. This will result in maintaining the alert state of the cerebral cortex. Touch, pain, temperature, all those sensations can wake you up at night. So for example, if it's too hot or too cold in the night, you will find yourself waking up to modify the temperature of the AC. All right, so all those are going to be sensations that will activate the reticular formation to maintain the alert state. So again, what happens if a person got an injury of the RAS, reticular activating system? A person will be in a permanent unconscious state or coma. If we look at here at the protection of the brain, first protection is going to be the scalp, the skin, and the hair. Underneath the skin and hair, we've got the skull, the bones, the cranial bones. Located between the skull and the brain, we've got three membranes. Those are called the meninges or meningeal membranes. We've got a watery cushion to the brain, fluid circulating around the brain. This is going to be my cerebrospinal fluid. And we've got a protection to the brain that prevents the diffusion of toxins, for example, from the blood to the brain We call this is a blood-brain barrier. And can you remind me, please, what was the name of the neuroglial cell that shares in the formation of the blood-brain barrier that connects the blood vessels to the nerve cells? Exactly, astrocytes. The cells that looks like a star that connects the blood vessels to the brain cells that will be responsible for the energy metabolism for the nerve cells. Those were the astrocytes. They are also sharing in the formation of the blood-brain barrier. So we're looking closer here at the different protective layers. We've got skin outside, scalp. Underneath the skin, we've got the bone. And remember, the bone is surrounded by a membrane. If you remember, what is the membrane that is surrounding the bones? It's my periosteum. So you've got the periosteum on the outside here of the bone and on the inside because it's on both sides. The internal layer here of the periosteum, the internal periosteum, is gonna be fused with the meningeal part, and both together, the periosteum on the inside surface of the bone and the meningeal part, both of them gonna be considered my first meninges, meningeal layer. It's my dura mater. So the very first membrane that will be covering the brain from outside is formed of the periosteal part and the meningeal part. We call this is my dura mater. Underneath the dura mater, if you see on here, a meningeal membrane that is formed by a spider web shaped fibers. And this is where the blood vessels gonna be troubling. We call this layer, it's my arachnoid matter. Arachnoid matter. A third meningeal membrane is, you see on here, it's a very delicate membrane, very smooth, that will be covering the gyri, sulci, and fissures of the brain. We call this as the pia mater. Pia mater. This is going to be our third meningeal membrane. So again, 3 meninges that we're looking at in here. We've got the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and then pia mater. The cerebrospinal fluid is going to be a watery solution that will contain less protein and different ion concentrations than the plasma. Do you remember what part of the brain was responsible for the formation of the cerebrospinal fluid? Do you remember what part of the brain that we mentioned that is responsible for the formation of the cerebrospinal fluid? What part of the brain was responsible for the formation of the cerebrospinal fluid? It's my choroid plexus. Choroid plexus that was part of the epithalamus, right? So let me review again Where did we have the choroid plexus? Remember how many parts of the brain that we've discussed? How many parts are forming the brain? 4. We've got cerebrum. We've got the diencephalon. We've got the brainstem. And we've got the cerebellum. Remember, the cerebrum was formed by the cerebral hemispheres, and we divided the cerebral hemispheres into 5 different lobes. Each of the cerebral hemispheres has an outer part, the gray matter, it's the cerebral cortex, and the connection between the 2 cerebral hemispheres, this was the corpus callosum. If you remember, the diencephalon was formed of 3 different parts. What are the 3 different parts of the diencephalon? We've got thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Remember, the nickname of the thalamus is the vice president. The nickname of the hypothalamus was the secretary of the office. You remember, the epithalamus was formed of 2 different parts. Two different parts on here. Choroid plexus, that will be producing the CSF, and the pineal gland that will be releasing the melatonin that regulates the sleep-wake cycles. Brainstem was formed of 3 different parts, which are midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The cerebellum was formed of 2 cerebellar hemispheres connected by the vermis. All right, so again, what part of the brain was responsible for the production of the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid again? What part of the brain is responsible for the production of CSF? It's my choroid plexus. Choroid plexus. All right. Is this clear? Is this clear for everybody? Where is the choroid plexus? All right, so the choroid plexus, as you see on here, is going to be producing the CSF. The CSF, it's going to be circulating in my lateral ventricles, will travel to my 3rd ventricle, And from this third ventricle, it passes through the cerebral aqueduct, remember, that passes in the midbrain, that travels in the midbrain, to be connected to the fourth ventricle that is located between the pons medulla on one side and the cerebellum on the other side. Where the CSF will go is going to be passing inside the central canal of the spinal cord. Also, it's going to be circulating around the brain and spinal cord. And as you see on here, the site of drainage of the CSF is going to be through the arachnoid villi. So what are the arachnoid villi? They are those connections between the subarachnoid space that contains the fluid, CSF, and the sinuses that are containing the blood. This is my superior sagittal sinus, and the CSF is going to be drained in the venous circulation. So which one do you think is going to be higher? The rate of the production of the CSF or the rate of drainage of the CSF? Would you be forming more or draining more than what you're forming? Which one do you think? Should be equal, exactly. Should be equal. Why it should be equal? Because if what I'm draining is greater than what I'm forming, I will lose the different functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. And what are the functions here of the cerebrospinal fluid? Providing protection to the brain and spinal cord. They will be nourishing the brain and carries away the chemical signals, if you remember, in order to terminate the action of the neurotransmitters, we need to wash them away or break them down. What if I am forming more CSF than what I'm draining? I will be filling the ventricles of the brain with fluid, and this can result in hydrocephalus. You see on here, major enlargement of the ventricles will result in compression of the brain tissue. You see, it can't get that bad. You see, major enlargement of the ventricles. If I have a blockage in the venous drainage or I have excessive formation, we call this is the hydrocephalus. All right, for the second question for today, it's going to be put the protective coverings here of the brain in the correct order, moving from outside in. Moving from outside in. So from outside, you've got dura mater, and then arachnoid matter, and the soft, delicate membrane that will be covering the gyri and sulci of the brain. This is my pia matter. So the correct order is going to be 2, 3, 1, which is number D, exactly. This is again the second question for today's in-class activity. All right, so moving on to the spinal cord. The spinal cord contains 31 pairs of nerves. And we've got cervical and lumbar enlargements. You see on here, this is my cervical enlargement of the spinal cord, and this would be my lumbar enlargement. So why do I have an enlargement? Why is this? Those two parts of the spinal cord are much larger in size compared to the rest of the spinal cord. What's so special about the cervical region and the lumbar region? Any guesses? This is actually where these nerves innervating the upper and lower limbs are getting their origin from. So I have the cell bodies of those nerve fibers are located in my spinal cord. So this part of the spinal cord is going to be containing the nerve cells that will carry the signals to my upper and lower limbs. So in the cervical region, I've got the nerve fibers, the nerve cells that would be distributing the signals to my upper limbs. And in the lumbar region, I got the nerve cells that are distributing the muscles, the signals to my lower limbs. All right. Is this clear? We don't call nerves the exoskeletal nerves. I'm not sure which ones are you asking about, Theodore. You mean the upper and lower limbs, right? Upper and lower limbs. All right. So yes, the nerve cells are located inside the spinal cord, and their long axons are going to be the nerves that will reach to innervate my biceps, my deltoid, my extensor carpi radialis longus. Those are all coming from the cervical region. And if we're moving down from the lumbar region, you've got the nerve fibers that will be innervating the muscles, skin of the lower limb. In between, we don't have much to innervate. See, it's not, I don't have that large number of muscles in the chest and the abdomen. Yes, I have definitely some muscles, but they don't have a huge number of nerve fibers that are innervating them. All right. How your So another part of the spinal cord that we are looking at in here is going to be the coda equina. Coda equina is the continuation of the spinal cord, but as nerve fibers. So you see, just nerve fibers will keep going down. It looks like a horse tail. That's why we called it coda equina. Spinal cord is going to be a two-way communication between the brain and the body. I'm sending sensory impulses up to the brain. Those are the ascending pathways. And I'm conducting the motor signals down from the brain to my muscles and glands. And those are going to be carried through the descending pathway. So spinal cord is going to be transporting sensory impulses up motor impulses down. The spinal cord has very similar protective layers like what we've seen in the brain. We've got bone, which are the vertebrae. Meninges are still going to be covering down the spinal cord. The three dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater is still going to be keeping them around the spinal cord. And we've got the CSF also circulating inside the central canal of the spinal cord and around the spinal cord. We've got an extra layer that we didn't have back in the brain, which is a cushion of fat and networks of veins that is going to be located in the epidural space between the vertebrae and the dura mater. The CSF is located like what we've seen in the brain in the subarachnoid space. So if I'm drawing here the different protective layers of the spinal cord, the very first layer outside is going to be bone. Next is going to be fat and veins. In the epidural space, then I have my dura mater. Then I have my arachnoid mater. And I have the CSF in the subarachnoid space, in the space below the arachnoid mater. And finally, I've got here the pia mater. This is here is the CSF. So those are the protective layers around the spinal cord. Looking closer at the structure of the spinal cord, we can see spinal cord has two main components: gray matter that has an H-shaped appearance, and this gray matter is surrounded by the white matter like you see on here. So again, what we're looking at the transverse section in the spinal cord, the H-shaped part at the center of the spinal cord. This is my gray matter. And if you remember what is forming a gray matter in your central nervous system, gray matter, it's formed by cell bodies and iron-myelinated nerve fibers. Outside, we've got the white matter. And if you remember, when we mentioned the white matter, we mentioned that it's formed by myelinated nerve fibers. So the gray matter is actually gonna have the nerve cells, the cell bodies of the nerve cells. And the white matter is gonna have the axons of those nerve cells that are myelinated and will be traveling up or down to carry the signals. And if you remember, the clusters of axons inside the CNS is what we call a tract. So if I'm looking here at the spinal cord, I have an internal H-shaped gray matter. And again, what's forming the gray matter? The gray matter, it's formed by cell bodies of the neurons and unmyelinated nerve fibers to a lesser extent. Yeah, it's the reverse of what we've seen in the brain. The brain did have the gray matter outside and the white matter inside. Here, the white matter is outside, the gray matter is inside. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Theodore, for pointing this. So the gray matter in the brain, cerebral hemisphere, the cerebral cortex was the gray matter and it was outside, and the corpus callosum, it's inside. Same for the cerebellum. Cerebellum did have the gray matter on the outside, and the white matter, the arbor vitae, was inside. Here, the spinal cord, the white matter is actually outside, and the gray matter is inside. All right, because remember, the main function of the spinal cord is to conduct the signals up and down. So I need those myelinated nerve fibers to carry the signals as fast as possible along the length of the spinal cord. All right. Questions? So you can notice also that the spinal cord, the gray matter of the spinal cord, has horns. It has dorsal horns and ventral horns. And in the thoracic region, we're going to have lateral horns as well, only in the thoracic region. What is the importance of the ventral horn and the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord? The dorsal horn is where you're going to be receiving sensations. So all sensory impulses from the different receptors are going to be conducted towards the spinal cord through the dorsal horn of the gray matter. Those are all sensory impulses. The posterior part of the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord is going to be receiving the signals that are somatic sensory. So I'm receiving sensations from skin, muscles, and joints. The anterior part of the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord is going to be responsible to receive the signals from the visceral organs. So I'm getting visceral sensory signals from stomach, from blood vessels, and so on. The ventral horn, or the anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, it's the one that will be responsible to send out the motor impulses to the effector organs. The anterior horn, or the ventral horn of the gray matter, on here, so all this, the ventral horn, is going to be sending out the motor impulses to the effector organs. What motor impulses? only the somatic motor impulses. I'm sending out the signals to my skeletal muscles only, which are under voluntary control. Just my skeletal muscles. How about your stomach, urinary bladder, and so on, that are not under voluntary control? You're going to be using the nerve cells located here in the lateral horn, which is consisting mainly in the thoracic region. So this is going to be responsible for the conduction of the visceral motor signals. Visceral motor signals. All right, so how do you form the spinal nerve? Spinal nerve has two roots. The dorsal root and the ventral root. And they both will fuse together to form my spinal nerve. So a spinal nerve, as you see on here, it's going to be a mixed nerve. What I mean by a mixed nerve, it carries sensory impulses towards the spinal cord. So I have sensory fibers. In the same time, I'm carrying motor impulses from the spinal cord to the effector organ. So I have motor fibers. All right. So again. All spinal nerves that we've got are mixed nerves. What this means? This means that they carry both sensory impulses through their sensory fibers, nerve fibers on here, and they carry motor impulses through their motor nerve fibers. So you see on here, any spinal nerve has a dorsal root and a ventral root. The dorsal root of the spinal cord is connected to the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. The ventral root is going to be connected to the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. This is where I've got the nerve cells. All right, so lateral horn. Ganglion from the CNS combine to form the spinal nerves. Yes, so you see on here, if I'm drawing the gray matter of the spinal cord, just one side on here. Let's say I did touch a hot surface with my hand. So this is my skin on here. It contains receptors that will be detecting heat. Those nerve fibers that will act as receptors will be sending the signal to my brain for me to feel that I did touch a hot surface. So how this happens? The cell body of the nerve on here, dorsal root ganglion cells. So those are nerve cell bodies on here. Cell bodies located outside of your CNS. So what we call the cell bodies located outside of the CNS, they are not inside my spinal cord even. What do we call the cells bodies outside of the CNS? Cell bodies outside of the CNS are called what? Ganglion. So this is what we call the ganglion. If you remember, we mentioned dorsal root ganglia was an example last time of a unipolar nerve cell. So the signal is going to be traveling from my skin through the axon on here, and will keep going towards my spinal cord. This is where I will have a synapse with the nerve cell located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. All right. So in the gray matter, I have the cell bodies that will be receiving the signal from the initial nerve cell. How is this signal going to be transported to my brain? So the axon here is going to be passing to the white matter according to what kind of sensation, what kind of tract would I be traveling through. This is a type of detail that I'm not going to be covering in this lecture. All right. But the axon of those neurons going to be traveling up towards my brain. And those are myelinated nerve fibers because they are traveling for long distances. So those are myelinated nerve fibers. And they are forming together bundles of myelinated nerve fibers that are carrying the signals up towards my brain. Those are called tracts. And they are located in my white matter of the spinal cord. So the white matter outside is formed of the axons of those nerve cells carrying signals up to the brain, in this example of sensations. What if I'm sending down from the brain a signal to contract the muscle? So this is my brain on here. This is my central gyrus. So you see the signals, the sensory impulses have reached my primary somatosensory cortex. This is my primary somatosensory cortex in the post-central gyrus. In the pre-central gyrus on here, I want to respond. So I have a nerve cell inside the gray matter of the cerebral cortex on here that will initiate the motor action. This is the gray matter. It's formed of cell bodies, right? And this nerve cell is going to be sending out the signals to travel down to the spinal cord. And again, this is going to be a myelinated nerve fiber because it's traveling down for long distances, so I need to be so fast. So I'm traveling through another tract carrying the signals this time down from the brain in the spinal cord. And the signal keeps going down in this tract until you reach the level of the muscles that you want to innervate. So let's say I wanted to contract my biceps brachii. I need to contract my biceps in order to pull my hand away from this hot surface. Here I'm not asking about a reflex. Here we're not discussing a reflex action. This is like a regular hot surface that you decided to move your hand away. It's not that hot for you to pull your hand away as a reflex. This is not a reflex. So you decided to move your hand away from the surface that you're touching, regardless whether it's hot or not. All right, so the signal traveling down from the brain to the spinal cord through tracts, myelinated nerve fibers. When I reach the level of the muscles that I want to innervate, what will I do? I will be connecting the nerve cell coming down all the way from the brain to another nerve cell located in the ventral root of the gray matter of the spinal cord. This is another nerve cell. And this nerve cell located in the ventral root and the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord is going to be conducting its signal through its axon traveling outside of the spinal cord. So this is what we call the nerve on here. So the cell body of the nerve that is conducting the motor signals to the muscle is located in the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. But the cell body of the sensory cell that will be receiving the signal from the skin to the spinal cord is located outside as a ganglion. But it needs to be connected to another cell body of another nerve cell in the dorsal horn of the gray matter, which axon gonna be conducting the signal up to my brain. What do we call the nerve fibers that are conducting these signals up and down in my spinal cord? Those are tracts. What do we call the nerve fibers that are either carrying signals from the receptors to the spinal cord or from the spinal cord to the effector organs? Remember, those nerve fibers located outside of the CNS are called nerves. The ganglion, it's the cluster of cell bodies, just this part. But the axon here, it's going to be considered a nerve because it's a collection of it's a collection of axons outside of the CNS. All right. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? This example, the ganglion that we're speaking about, it's going to be the ganglion formed of cell bodies carrying sensory signals. This is a specific example. I don't want to get into many other details, all right? But it might be motor, might be for a specific nerve, all right? It's not essentially sensory, but in this specific example, the one I mentioned, it's a sensory nerve cell, which cell bodies are forming this specific ganglion. All right, so again, White matter is going to be formed by tracts that are either carrying signals up or signals down. So they are either ascending sensory or descending motor, like what you see on here. Signals up or signals down. If a person had a spinal cord trauma, this might result in paresthesia or paralysis. Paresthesias, those are sensory loss. So if a person got a spinal cord injury, so I will be cutting those tracts. The tract that is carrying the sensory impulses up and the tract that will be carrying the motor impulses down. So I can't send motor signals to contract my muscles. I don't have any voluntary control on the skeletal muscles. I'm not able to contract them. This is paralysis. And I don't feel, I have a sensory loss. So it's paresthesia. As the signal here is not reaching my brain. So remember, this is where you're going to be decoding the signals in order for you to detect the presence of a specific sensation and to interpret this sensation. All right, so looking at the spinal cord another time and its relation to the skeletal muscles. So looking here, this is the primary motor cortex located in the precentral gyrus of the brain. This is where I initiate the voluntary motor movement. So I've got a nerve cell traveling down, then crosses to the other side in the spinal cord. Remember, the cerebral hemispheres are controlling the contralateral side of the body, so the nerve cell gonna be crossing to the other side. This is where it's gonna be connected to the nerve cell located in the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So this is the nerve cell on here. This nerve cell, it exits the spinal cord, conducting the signal now to my skeletal muscle. Let's say this skeletal muscle is my biceps, just as an example. We call this nerve cell traveling down from the brain all the way down in the spinal cord. This is going to be my upper motor neuron. Through the upper motor neuron, I'm not only sending excitatory impulses. So it's not only about sending out signals that allows me to contract the muscle, but I'm also determining the tone of the muscle, the force of contraction. So it's not about only excitation signals, it might also be inhibitory signals that are meant to control the activity and the force of contraction of the muscle. The nerve cells that is going to be coming out from the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, this is what we call the lower motor neuron. lower motor neuron. So again, two nerve cells that we see on here, upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron. But this is not the only type of signals that I am getting to the skeletal muscle. If I tap on the tendon, for example, of a skeletal muscle, I will see that the muscle responds by contracting. This is a reflex. So I have another type of signals that would be reaching the muscle. If, for example, I tap on the tendon, the stretch on here of the muscle gonna be felt and will be conducted to the spinal cord, and I don't need to send out those sensations to the brain to get the confirmations that I need to contract the muscle. Instead, the nerve cell will be directly connected to the motor cell on here and will cause you to send out a signal for you to contract the muscle. So it's a loop. I didn't send to the brain. So why we're saying all this is to mention the difference between two different types of paralysis. Again, what is meant by paralysis? Paralysis means I've lost the ability to contract the muscle. So in case of transection of the spinal cord, so I cut here, I got a nerve damage, prolapse of intervertebral disc. If I injured the lower motor neuron, would there be any kind of signals reaching this muscle, either voluntary from the brain or reflex? Is there going to be any signals reaching this muscle? What do you think? No, neither the voluntary or the reflex signals, because the lower motor neuron is the one that's going to be conducting both kinds of signals. So no signals are going to be reaching this muscle. This muscle has no tone, because what keeps the muscles partially contracted, it's going to be the degree of stretch applied to the muscle. So if I don't have a reflex, so there will be no tone in the muscles. This is a flaccid paralysis. So a flaccid paralysis, it's going to be due to the injury or damage of the ventral root of the spinal cord, of the spinal nerve, or the ventral horn of the spinal cord. On the other hand, if a person got a stroke, so a blood clot blocked the blood vessel, given the blood supply to this part of the brain. So I injured the upper motor neuron. I have intact lower motor neuron. Would I be able to perform a voluntary contraction of this muscle? What do you think? Can you decide to perform a voluntary contraction of this muscle if you've lost your upper motor neuron? No, you cannot. So paralysis, I can't contract my muscle. Would you have reflexes? So if I tap on the tendon, if I tap on this tendon of the muscle, If I tap on the tendon of the muscle on here, so I have intact lower motor neuron, intact lower motor neuron. So if I tap on the tendon of the muscle, would this muscle contract? Yes or no? Do I have any reflex? Do I have any reflex? Yes, I have reflex. I have exaggerated reflex because this is the only thing I have. I've lost the upper motor neuron. I have exaggerated reflexes. I have hypertonia, like this kid on here. He has paralysis, but it's associated with an increase in the muscle tone. You see, hypertonia. Hypertonia. Muscles are contracted, but he can't move his limbs. He still have a paralysis, but it's a type of paralysis that we call spastic paralysis. So spastic paralysis is due to an injury in the upper motor neuron. An upper motor neuron lesion might be due to CP, cerebral palsy, due to difficulty during labor. So the head of the baby got squeezed in the birth canal for too long. So this caused the insult to the brain. Or later in age, a person had a stroke, so he had a blockage in the blood supply to the motor part in the cerebral cortex. So those are examples here of upper motor neuron lesions. No voluntary control, definitely. I don't have voluntary control, but I have hyperreflexia, I have hypertonia, I have exaggerated muscle tone. All right, questions? So again, our exams all have been postponed to be due on August 7. August 7. Please note that the diagrams that we've seen today in the central nervous system are of great importance for the 4th lab exam. Although chapter 12 is part of module 3, but those anatomical structures of the brain, spinal cord that we've discussed today are highly important for our 4th lab exam. All right, for the 4th lab exam. It's part of the 4th lab exam. So very important.